Welcome back to Face the Nation. Overnight, there were tense confrontations between demonstrators and police in Rochester, New York, and in Portland, Oregon. They're the latest in a series of protests, some of which have turned violent this summer since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Joining us now is Wesley Lowery, correspondent for 60 in 6. Wesley just returned from Kenosha, Wisconsin, where he was covering the shooting of Jacob Blake. Wes, it's good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So we have heard a lot about Kenosha. It's in the middle of this presidential campaign. You were there. What's happening there? What's the scene?
Certainly. I just got back earlier this week from Kenosha and spent some time on the ground there. And look, it's not unlike a lot of the other cities in the last few years and certainly the last few months where we've seen unrest on the ground, right? Initially, there is kind of an organic anger that turns sometimes into violence. We saw this in Kenosha, some buildings burnt down. Then you have a rush of people who come in. And in this case, that was both folks who wanted to commit violence as well as these kind of vigilante groups. We had this shooting involved Kyle Rittenhouse. But then once the dust settles, what you're left with are the locals, the people who live there, the people who are still there even after some of us get on the plane and go back home. And so what we see in Kenosha is some ongoing energy, ongoing protest, frustrations. Kenosha is one of a series of cities and towns in kind of southeast Wisconsin between Chicago and Milwaukee. Old factory towns, used to be auto manufacturers, places that in a lot of ways, industry left behind. And so you do see, even though this is a primarily white stretch of the country, minority populations there that are impoverished, that feel like they're dealing with discrepancies. And so there is some tension and racial tension beneath the surface there in Kenosha. And so even as some of the cameras leave and our attention turns to the next story, this energy from the protest and this fallout from Jacob Blake's shooting, I think is going to remain kind of at the fore, at least in Kenosha locally.
And compare it for us, Wes, if you would, to what you saw in Minneapolis after George Floyd, which is to say, does that energy you describe manifest itself in reform, in new laws, in pushing for that, or is it different?
Well, it's different in part because in Minneapolis, you were seeing George Floyd was in many ways the latest in what had been a series of cases. That area had dealt with many high-profile cases of police use of force, from Philando Castile to Justine Damon, year after year after year, while in Kenosha, this is the first major incident. Not that folks on the ground don't have their own anecdotes and stories. And so I note that because, one, you see in Kenosha a kind of protest and organizing that's more in its infancy versus Minneapolis, where it was very mature and developed. But second, in Minneapolis, the demonstrators, the organizers, this energy had time to influence the local politics. There were members of the council locally who had themselves been demonstrators and protest. You had kind of progressive politicians up and down. The politics of Kenosha and the politics of Wisconsin are a little bit different. And so what we see is that this is kind of the beginning of a process in Kenosha, Wisconsin, while in Minneapolis, George Floyd was actually much later in the process as it comes to the influence and the organization of these types of folks.
I want to ask you, Wes, about some of your great reporting that's in your 60 in 6 piece, which is you talked to the person who took the footage of Jacob Blake. What did you hear in that conversation?
Of course, yeah, Rayshawn White. He was the first person I wanted to talk to when I got to the ground, having covered a lot of these police cases in the past. I'm always interested in the people who are thrust into the story. Rayshawn White's this 22-year-old. He lives across the street. He hears a commotion outside, and look, we're all nosy neighbors. He sticks his head out the window, ends up capturing this video that changes the city he lives in, and one might argue changes the nation. And, when we talked, this was maybe 2 weeks after the shooting, and he was still really grappling with the implications of what had happened. He was obsessively following the coverage from the protest to looting to the shooting now by Kyle Rittenhouse of these protesters. And he was having trouble not succumbing to an anxiety that it was all his fault. Should he have taken this video? Should he have shared it? If he hadn't, would any of this stuff happened? And so I was really fortunate. I really appreciated the time he spent kind of talking through the collateral consequence of doing the right thing, seeing something happening, turning his phone on, sharing it with the world. So now we can all decide what we think of that incident for ourselves. But that this doesn't end for him. He's still sitting there with the stress, with an anxiety, and wondering, did he do the right thing?
All right, Wesley Lowery, thank you so much for your reporting on the ground and for being with us. And we'll be right back in a moment. As we told you earlier, former Vice President Biden has kept his national lead over President Trump, maintaining a 10-point advantage through both parties' conventions. Biden holds a lead also in a number of battleground states, including a 6-point lead in Wisconsin. For the state of the race, we turn to CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. He's in Westchester County, New York. Anthony, good morning.
Good morning, John. How are you?
I'm well. It's always good to see you. Let's start with my favorite question at the beginning of every one of these surveys, which is, what is the story of this race right now?
It is very much about the president. Voters tell us that they are evaluating this race based on what they have seen over the last 4 years, even more so than what they think might happen in the next 4, and even more than what they think Joe Biden might do if elected. Now, maybe that's not unusual for an incumbent president, but we also tested that directly, and that evaluation on the president, for good or for bad, is the thing that really stands out. It is also, John, very much about intensity. We have seen, especially since the conventions, voters locked in. We're approaching 9 in 10 who say their mind is made up. Good luck finding swing voters this year. We've done tens of thousands of interviews. I can assure you they are rare. But that intensity is why you will hear over the next weeks both campaigns talking about motivation, talking about turnout, because it really is about that intensity, John.
But it's important, that point about referendum, because the president in his convention tried to turn this race into a choice. And when you're a president with a low approval rating, a referendum is not good for you.
Indeed. In fact, even half of Joe Biden's voters say that this is for them about the president. And so, yes, that despite the fact that the campaign has tried to shift this to make it about what Joe Biden will do and being more prospective in that approach, so far not moving that needle, John.
Is COVID-19 still weighing the president down?
It is. It's done a couple of things. One is we talk about how you evaluate the president. Well, his argument, which we've tested, is does he get credit for stemming what could have been a worse set of fatalities, a worse outbreak? And on balance, voters are telling us no. They think the administration could have done more. They think that things could have been better had there been more planning. And the other political outcome of that, John, is that that sentiment has put in play a number of states across the country, particularly the states where the outbreak has hit hard, particularly many in the Sun Belt. That has moved those states into toss-up or lean categories as well. So it's really had the effect of expanding the map too, John.
Anthony, we've seen the president try to shift what this conversation is about in this election. He wants it to be not about COVID-19, but about violence in the cities. What do your numbers tell you about that strategy?
Okay, so we asked about the protest and each candidate, how they're speaking to it, how they're handling it. Biden comes out better on that measure, and particularly, we asked if each candidate seemed to be trying to calm the situation or maybe encourage even more tension. Well, the president, on balance, is seen as encouraging more tension, more fighting. Joe Biden's seen by more as trying to calm the situation. So that nets out towards Joe Biden, or at least not moving the needle in any negative way with regard to Biden. The other point on this, John, is the argument the president seems to be making is that voters might be worried if political violence extends into the suburbs. Well, we talk to people in the suburbs, and they tell us they're not concerned that there might be violence in their neighborhood. So that doesn't seem to be resonating. You know, I think at a broader point, a lot of folks compare this era in this respect maybe to what we saw in the late 60s and early 70s as far as protests are concerned. We should state for context, the country is different than it was then. The electorate is more diverse today. The suburbs have more diversity today, and racial attitudes have shifted. We've seen that certainly in the polling over the last few months. So that could be one reason why that attempt hasn't found a lot of resonance.
All right, Anthony, thanks as always for giving us the rundown there. And we're now going to turn to the man who has been out on the campaign trail, seeing all of this with his eyes. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, I want to start with, we're going to get to some of those numbers Anthony talked about, but I want to start with this piece in The Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg, which recounts a number of instances in which the president had disparaging things to say about those who had fought in the military and died. There have been a lot of explosive things that have happened in this presidency. Do you think this matters at all in the campaign, or is it just another flashpoint?
It's certainly a flashpoint where I think the Biden campaign believes there could be potential political advantage for them is with rank and file members of the military, their families, and military veterans. And it's all part of the broader appeal to pick off disaffected Republicans or independents who might have voted for President Trump before, don't want to this year, but still need reason to vote for Joe Biden. And so I think what we saw when this was released, and again, you know, these are remarks that the president and his team strongly dispute, and we've seen more people on the president's side at least put their names to those disputes than, of course, people who confirmed it for Jeffrey Goldberg, is that this isn't now just about John McCain or about military leaders that the president would have met with to discuss military policy. It's about you, they're arguing. It's about you and your military family and the sacrifice that you or your brother or your husband made while serving in the military. Biden himself was quite struck by this, invoking the memory of his son Beau, who served, saying, you know, how could you consider his service, or how could you consider him a sucker? How could you consider those that died in battle a loser, and that the president should apologize? So it's probably more in that regard, they believe, effective than to the general understanding that, yes, this is a president who has said things in the past about his rivals, about the military, that isn't necessarily a surprise to people at this point.
That's right. It's a commander-in-chief saying anything disparaging about people who gave their lives in their country's service is obviously a flashpoint. It also seems, Ed, that it is, if the end of this race, or do you see it this way, that it's about turf. What's the debate about? Is it on Joe Biden's turf that the debate is taking place, or is it on turf that President Trump would like? It seems at the very least this is not turf that President Trump wants to be talking about.
Not at all. And that was part of why I think we saw the Biden campaign seize on this report so quickly, is that it allowed them to try to steer the conversation away from law and order and away from the economy, where he remains vulnerable when compared to the president, and raise again questions about his judgment and his character as they try to keep this focused on a referendum on the incumbent, which, as you said, would benefit him for sure.
And as you mentioned, law and order, the president went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, where there have been protests and violence. Joe Biden responded with a speech this week seeming to buy into the idea that he might have some vulnerability or exposure on this question of violence and law and order. Is that right? Does the Biden campaign see a vulnerability on that issue?
If they didn't, then why was he spending so much time this week making clear that he believes that looters and violent protesters are people who should be held accountable for their actions? I think they saw that last weekend, especially when the president was really hammering them on that as a potential weak spot, but they addressed it quickly. And they also pivoted it, again, in that sense of referendum. The violence is happening now. How is it that the president can manage it if it's happening now? Don't talk about how it might be handled in the future. And look, Biden went to Wisconsin, held a listening session, actually got to meet with the Blake family when the Trump campaign and the White House apparently struggled to make contact with them.
Ed, you've reported that the Biden campaign feels some pressure to get the vice president out there. What is that? Why do they feel that pressure? And what does it look like to campaign in this age of social distancing and mask wearing and all the rest of it?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because at the beginning of this pandemic, Americans widely told us they didn't care if they didn't see these guys campaigning in person. In essence, they understood that it wasn't possible. That's shifted. About 4 in 10 Democrats in our poll say they've got concerns about Biden not being out there, and about half of independents also say they'd like to see him out more. So in the coming days, you'll see Biden go to Pennsylvania twice and to Michigan. He's talked about going to North Carolina. We'll probably see them at some point go to Arizona, which is a state they're obsessed about somehow trying to win. And again, it's quick day trips, much like the president. Biden admitted this week he has been tested for COVID. He will be on a regular basis. And his campaign has vowed to let us know if for some reason at some point something shows up in those tests that would cause concern. So, they're taking precautions, but they now do suddenly feel much more willing and able to get out there. And we expect them to make trips, maybe 2 or 3 a week, for the duration of the campaign.
And he'll be carrying those briefing books with him for his debate as well, the next other big stage at the end of this month. Ed, thanks so much. For more on our CBS News Battleground Tracker, log on to cbsnews.com/polls. We'll be right back. We sat down with philanthropist and author David Rubenstein last week to talk about his latest project, How to Lead. Wisdom from the world's greatest CEOs, founders, and game changers. It's a collection of conversations about the qualities it takes to be successful, which we might keep in mind when we're picking our next leader. David, you've been a leader. You've interviewed leaders. The country is in the middle of interviewing leaders right now for the presidency. If you were holding a job interview, knowing what you know about leadership, what would you look for in candidates?
I'm looking for their ability to focus, their ability to communicate well, their ability to have some sense of priority of what's most important to them, their ability to inspire people, their ability to rise to the occasion. And I also think humility is important. Anybody that is really a successful leader, I think, has failed in life, and you have to persist after your failures. But failure gives you some humility.
How do you test for humility when you're interviewing somebody and all they're trying to do is tell you how great they are?
Well, I often look at their sense of humor. I often ask questions that are designed to elicit a little bit of laughter, and if they don't play along, I realize that maybe they don't have a sense of humor, maybe they have no humility.
How important is that? If you're a leader, you have to have some human interaction ability with the people you're trying to lead.
The ability to lead really gets down to the ability to persuade. There are three ways you persuade people. Orally, you can write well, or you lead by example. George Washington and Valley Forge in 1777, he could have stayed at the Four Seasons down the corner, but he didn't. He stayed with his troops. He led by example. You want people that actually want to lead for the right reason. Do you want to lead somebody because you want to be famous, you want to be rich, or do you want to lead somebody because you're trying to do something really important? And I've observed in my book, in my interviews, the people that really achieve the greatest things, they're not worried about the material things. They're worried about getting to some end, proving their point. Bill Gates wanted to prove that software was important. Jeff Bezos wanted to prove that he could sell things over the internet. Warren Buffett wanted to prove you could be in Omaha and be a good investor, whatever it might be.
So the material things meaning accumulation of wealth, having a yacht, having a big building, is that what you mean?
What you should want to do is to help other people. The greatest satisfaction, the happiest people I've seen are people that helped other people. People that they could be teachers, or they could be people that have given away lots of money or have invented things that have really helped other people, discovered medical devices that are wonderful, or cures for diseases. Those are the people that are happy. The people that aren't happy are the people that don't really know why they are on the face of the earth. You should realize in the end you're on the face of the earth for a relatively short period of time, and the greatest happiness comes about when you achieve things for other people, not for yourself.
If knowing why you're on the face of the earth is your driving, organizing principle, is that what drives you every day you get up in the morning? How do you work that into kind of a daily plan if you're a leader?
I think people that learn how to be leaders learn how to do this during the course of their life. And when they reach the point where they really are good leaders, they have reached the point where they know what they really want to do with themselves. My observation is that while there are people like Bill Clinton, who was a Rhodes Scholar, became President of the United States, as a general rule, the people that are running the world were not the superstars in the first third of life. They may have burned out. They may realize that being a superstar in the first third wasn't what it was cracked up to be. So the people that are running the world today in the second and third of their lives are not people that were observed at the age of 15 or 20 to be the superstars. And so there's hope for all of us who didn't succeed in the early part, that you can rise up and do something maybe significant with your life later on.
I have a lot of personal experience with failure, but teach me to fail.
Well, and the truth is, with failure, you have to observe what you did wrong and why it didn't work out. And if you say, you know what, this isn't good, I'm not really talented, I'm going to just go back and sit at my office or sit at my house and not do anything, then you won't be a leader. But if you say, I learned something from this, I know how to overcome this, I can do this better in the future.
You said humility comes from having failed and learning to overcome them. So in that sense, it's kind of a byproduct. How does humility help if you're a leader prospectively?
Well, if you're trying to become a leader, I think you have to get other people to follow you. In other words, you can't say, I'm going to be a leader, and nobody follows you. You have to have people follow you. How do you get people to follow you? Well, you have to give them certain sense that you have a way of going somewhere, that you're going to take them on a vision and on a voyage that's going to be useful for them as well as for you. And to do that, I think you have to be sympathetic with them. You have to say, look, this is good for both of us. It's not just good for me because I'll be more famous. You have to say, we're going to do this together. And that's how you really make people follow you.
Relentlessness. How important is that?
I think it's indispensable. So relentlessness, another word that's often used that way, is resilience. You have to be resilient, and you have to take the punching you're going to get in life and come back. So you all, when we were growing up, we all had these like the little punching bags. You punch it and it comes right back at you. But that's what you have to do. People are going to punch you all the time. You have to come back, and it's like when you're a little kid. You know, people who are bullies, well, they'll punch you, and you have to come back to them. And in the end, you know, in the adult bullying kind of thing, it's the same kind of thing. People will say he's a terrible person, he's incompetent, he's not smart, it's a terrible idea. Well, if you take this personally and you go home and call your mother and say, look, people think I'm terrible, you're not probably going to be a great leader. What you have to do is be resilient about it and come back. And remember, nobody can be liked 100% by everybody. There's always going to be people that don't like you. And so if you can't stand the heat, as they say, you've got to get out of the kitchen.
How is presidential leadership different than in other sectors?
There are three ways you can persuade people, that a president can, but other people can as well. You learn how to write well. So let's suppose you are a very good writer, and you're Thomas Jefferson, and you wrote the Declaration of Independence. That can persuade people. Or you're a very good orator. You're John Kennedy, and you give the inaugural address in 1961. But leading by example is the most effective way to do it, I think. And I think many presidents who have been successful have led by example, and I think Abraham Lincoln is a good example. He showed people his humility, that he was going to bring his team of rivals in with him, that he didn't brag about what he was doing, and that he recognized he had lots of failings. He's the kind of person who, you know, led by example. When people were in his presence, they would realize they were in the presence of a great man.
Is it important for presidents to take responsibility as fulfilling that example function that you talked about?
Well, as a general rule of thumb, I think it's a good idea for anybody to take responsibility, because if you say, in any case, well, it wasn't my fault, or I didn't do anything to deserve that bad thing happening, you know, in the end, people hear you and they say, well, you know, who was responsible? You were in charge. And I don't mean a president of the United States, but any position. You should take responsibility and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. People will admire you more if you say you take responsibility.
David Rubenstein, the book is How to Lead. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Margaret Brennan will be back next week for Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson.